"You're embarrassing yourself," the captain sneered, towering over Camille Dawson as passengers stared in uncomfortable silence. "This section is for professionals, not housekeepers playing dress-up." Calmly, Camille rose from her seat, locked eyes with him, and said, "I'm Camille Dawson, CEO of this airline, and you're about to learn who truly doesn't belong here." "Excuse me, ma'am, economy boarding is that way," Jessica Price said curtly, barely glancing up from her tablet as Camille Dawson, dressed in faded jeans, a plain navy top, and worn sneakers, approached the first-class boarding lane. Camille smiled politely, presenting her boarding pass without a word, her heart steady, her face composed. She had expected this reaction. She had counted on it. After all, that was the whole point of today's mission. 41 years old, CEO of Summit Skies Airlines, Camille Dawson was not what most people expected when they pictured a corporate powerhouse. And that was exactly why she had chosen today, Flight 3342 from Dallas to New York, as one of her undercover evaluation trips. Wearing nothing flashy, carrying an old leather backpack instead of an executive briefcase, and pulling her natural hair back into a simple bun, Camille blended into the crowd of everyday travelers, exactly as she intended. Jessica took Camille's boarding pass with a sigh that was louder than necessary, scanning it with the air of someone doing a favor she didn't want to grant. Her eyebrows twitched upward when she saw the first-class assignment. Without offering a greeting, a smile, or even basic courtesy, she shoved the pass back into Camille's hand. Under her breath, but not low enough to go unheard, Jessica muttered to her colleague, "Don't know who booked her up there today. She'll throw off the whole look when the big bosses show up." Camille caught every word. She tucked her boarding pass away calmly, noting the agent's name badge, Jessica Price, and making a mental note of the treatment she had received before even stepping onto the plane. Inside the jet bridge, Camille allowed a few passengers ahead of her, creating a little space. She needed to observe the boarding process, how each customer was greeted, how first-class service expectations were upheld, or, more tellingly, abandoned based on appearance. As she stepped into the first-class cabin, the contrast was immediate. Senior Flight Attendant Colin Reeves, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair and a stiff posture, stood at the door alongside Captain Edward Blake, whose crisp uniform and authoritarian stance radiated the confidence of a man long accustomed to being obeyed without question. Both men's eyes swept over Camille. Both sets of lips thinned with visible distaste. "There goes our image," Colin muttered sideways, not quietly enough, to the captain. "Not today," Blake responded under his breath, his voice grim. "Not with the CEO's audit team on board. We need this cabin perfect, not this." His eyes flicked toward Camille's worn jeans and backpack like a man spotting a stain on white linen. Camille moved past them, saying nothing, every nerve sharp with observation. She took her assigned seat, row 1A, a window seat in the premium section, and calmly stowed her backpack under the seat in front of her. Around her, the atmosphere buzzed with low murmurs. A few passengers stole glances at her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and, in some cases, thinly veiled judgment. Moments later, Colin Reeves approached her row, a practiced smile plastered on his face that disappeared the moment he faced Camille. He leaned down slightly, adopting a tone thick with forced politeness. "Ma'am," he said, "I believe there's been a mistake with your seating. First class is reserved for our elite travelers. Let me see your boarding pass." Without flinching, Camille retrieved her boarding pass and handed it over. Colin's eyes darted from the document to Camille's casual outfit, his frown deepening. "This says 1A, he said unnecessarily, as if still searching for a reason to correct an error that didn't exist. "Yes," Camille replied evenly, her voice calm, professional. Colin hesitated, then gestured toward the back of the plane. "Perhaps you would be more comfortable in economy," he suggested with a tight smile, clearly meaning the opposite. From the cockpit doorway, Captain Blake watched, his arms folded across his chest. His gaze was cold, evaluating, dismissive. Finally, he strode down the aisle toward Camille. "Good morning," he said curtly, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "There's been some confusion. We have a very important inspection happening today." Our first-class cabin needs to maintain a certain standard. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air before adding, I'm sure you understand. Camille tilted her head slightly, meeting his gaze without blinking. I understand perfectly, she said. Captain Blake's jaw tightened. He clearly didn't appreciate the lack of submission. Look, he said, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial tone that was anything but friendly. This section is reserved for our professional clientele. Not housekeepers playing dress-up. The words hit the air like a slap. Around them, nearby passengers stiffened. Someone across the aisle lowered their phone, pretending to check messages while discreetly recording. Camille's posture remained unshaken. Inside, a slow, measured fire was building, but on the surface, she was the picture of poise. Is there a problem with my ticket, Captain? She asked, her voice a model of cool professionalism. Blake's lips thinned further. It's about maintaining the right image. Today, of all days. And what image would that be, exactly? Camille asked, her voice still calm but carrying an undeniable weight now. Blake exchanged a quick glance with Colin, who nodded slightly as if giving silent permission to escalate. Ma'am, Captain Blake said, raising his voice just enough to draw the attention of surrounding passengers, if you don't relocate voluntarily, I'll have security assist you. Camille leaned back slightly, pulled out her phone, and calmly said, then I would like your full name and employee ID, Captain. There was a beat of silence. Blake blinked. Colin shifted nervously beside him. The threat was not supposed to provoke a counter-demand. My name is Captain Edward Blake. Employee ID 68421, Blake said stiffly, clearly assuming this would cow her into backing down. And yours? Camille asked, turning her gaze to Colin. Colin Reeves, he muttered. Employee ID 37785. Camille entered the information into her phone, paused, and then tucked it away deliberately. Then she rose slowly to her feet, her stance straight and commanding. I think, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin now, it's time you both understood exactly who you're speaking to. Captain Blake's smugness faltered. Colin's face paled. I'm Camille Dawson, she said evenly, President and Chief Executive Officer of Summit Skies Airlines. The words dropped like a bomb in the cabin. Silence. Disbelief. A few audible gasps. A woman in row 2 actually dropped her coffee cup into her lap. Across the aisle, a man who had been recording nearly dropped his phone. Blake's face drained of color. Colin looked like he might physically collapse. Camille's eyes swept over them both, unflinching. And today, she continued, I am the audit team you've been preparing for. The humiliation was absolute. It crackled in the air like static. Passengers who had earlier judged her now looked anywhere but at her. Others shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had been complicit by their silence. Jessica Price at the gate, who had just boarded to assist, visibly staggered as she heard Camille's words. Captain Blake opened his mouth, perhaps to protest or excuse, but Camille raised one hand, stopping him mid-breath. No, she said. Save it. Her gaze swept the first-class cabin once more. You judged me not by my ticket, not by my conduct, but by my clothing and my skin, Camille said, her voice steady but cutting. You decided who was worthy and who wasn't. And you were wrong. Another heavy silence fell. Colin swallowed audibly. And now, Camille said, turning slightly as the flight security team boarded in response to Blake's earlier call for assistance, we're going to correct that mistake. The two security officers looked around, confused, having expected an unruly passenger, only to find the CEO standing calmly at the center of the unfolding reckoning. Camille met their eyes. Please escort Captain Blake and Senior Flight Attendant Reeves off this aircraft, she instructed, her voice authoritative but composed. Captain Blake sputtered a protest. Colin looked sick. But the security team moved forward, understanding instantly that the authority in the cabin did not rest with the captain anymore. As the two men were quietly removed under the stunned gazes of the first-class passengers, Camille returned to her seat, calm and deliberate. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to her executive team, audit of Flight 3342 underway. Immediate findings, systemic failure at critical touchpoints. And as the aircraft door closed again and the plane prepared for a delayed departure, Camille Dawson sat quietly in row 1A, her mission not just underway, but having already revealed a truth she would not allow her airline, or her industry, to ignore. The hush that had fallen over the cabin after Camille Dawson's revelation was so profound it seemed to thicken the very air. Every pair of eyes in first class was locked on her, on the woman who had, just moments ago, been treated as an unworthy intruder and who now stood revealed as the most powerful person in the airline. Captain Edward Blake and Senior Flight Attendant Colin Reeves stood frozen at the front of the cabin, their faces slack with shock and dawning horror. They had not just made a mistake, they had committed a career-ending error in front of dozens of witnesses. Camille, standing tall in her worn jeans and simple top, let the silence stretch for one excruciating beat longer before turning toward the two uniformed security officers who had arrived moments before, summoned under false pretenses to remove her. With a calm, commanding voice that brooked no argument, she said, "Please escort Captain Blake and Senior Flight Attendant Reeves off this aircraft." The officers, trained to recognize authority, hesitated for only a second before stepping forward. Blake immediately tried to recover, his hand shooting up in a placating gesture. "Miss Dawson, Madam CEO, there's been a terrible misunderstanding," he stammered, his earlier arrogance dissolving into desperate pleading. "If we had known who you were." Camille raised her hand sharply, stopping him mid-sentence. "That's exactly the problem," she said, her voice cutting through the cabin like a scalpel. "You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with basic respect." Blake's mouth opened and closed soundlessly as the officers gently but firmly positioned themselves on either side of him. Beside him, Colin Reeves looked as though he might faint, his face ashen, his hands trembling slightly. The officers began to guide them toward the exit, their steps heavy with the weight of consequences finally coming due. As they passed the seated passengers, no one met their eyes. Some looked down at their laps, others stared straight ahead, their faces masks of uncomfortable realization. A few continued recording silently, capturing history being made in real time. When the cockpit door swung open to allow Blake and Reeves to exit, the heavy thunk of it closing behind them felt symbolic, final. Camille exhaled slowly, gathering herself. She could feel the tension vibrating through the cabin, the unspoken question hanging thick in the air, what happens now? Turning, she scanned the first-class cabin, her gaze steady, her expression firm but not unkind. Her eyes found the young flight attendant who had earlier offered her a bottle of water without judgment or hesitation. Sofia Alvarez stood near the galley, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, watching Camille with wide, uncertain eyes. Camille offered her a small nod. "Miss Alvarez," she said, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had just dismantled two careers, "please step forward." Sofia did so, her movements careful but steady. "Effective immediately, I am appointing you acting senior flight attendant for Flight 3342, Camille announced. A collective ripple of surprise ran through the remaining crew and passengers. Sofia's mouth opened in shock, but she recovered quickly, squaring her shoulders. "Yes, ma'am," she said, her voice strong despite the tremor that betrayed her nerves. Camille gave her an encouraging smile. "You showed professionalism and kindness when no one was watching. That's the standard we should all aspire to." Turning to the remaining crew members, who had gathered uncertainly nearby, she continued, "We will proceed with this flight. I expect every passenger, and every cabin, to receive service that reflects the true values of Summit Skies Airlines. Dignity. Respect. Excellence." A few crew members nodded vigorously, others looked chastened, their earlier complacency replaced with a sober sense of accountability. Camille resumed her seat in row 1A, buckling her seatbelt and settling in as Sofia and the flight attendants moved quickly to complete final preparations for takeoff. The plane, though delayed, was finally ready to depart. As the engines rumbled to life and the aircraft pushed back from the gate, the atmosphere in first class shifted palpably. Where there had been smug superiority and whispered judgments, there was now a heavy, almost reverent silence. Passengers who had sneered or ignored Camille earlier now avoided meeting her gaze, some fidgeting awkwardly, others sneaking glances filled with new respect or shame. Sophia's voice came over the intercom, clear and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Summit Skies Flight 3342 with service from Dallas to New York. We apologize for the delay. We appreciate your patience and look forward to providing you with excellent service today." Camille listened closely as the pre-flight announcements continued. There was a different energy in Sophia's delivery, a sincerity that hadn't been present earlier when others had treated first class like an exclusive club rather than a service obligation. As the plane climbed steadily into the sky, Camille took out her worn notebook, the same one she carried on all her secret inspections, and began documenting everything she had witnessed: the names, the actions, the tone of voice, the way appearance had been weaponized to judge a paying customer unworthy. But she also made note of those who had gotten it right. Sophia's genuine kindness. The few crew members who, while complicit by silence, had not actively participated in the discrimination. Those would matter in the coming days. As the flight leveled off at cruising altitude, Sophia and her team began in-flight service. This time, Camille noticed a marked difference in the approach. Every passenger, regardless of attire or perceived status, received attentive, courteous service. Water and drinks were offered without hesitation. Smiles, real ones, accompanied every interaction. Camille sipped the glass of sparkling water Sophia brought her and nodded appreciatively. It wasn't just about putting on a show because the CEO was on board. Something deeper had shifted. Fear, yes, but also a dawning understanding of what true hospitality meant. About halfway through the flight, Sophia approached Camille's seat discreetly. "Miss Dawson," she said softly, "would you mind if I asked you something?" Camille set down her glass and looked up. "Of course," she replied. Sophia hesitated, gathering her thoughts. Why didn't you just announce who you were when they first treated you badly? It would have saved you so much hassle." Camille smiled, a sad but resolute smile. "Because the real test isn't how people behave when they know someone important is watching," she said. "The real test is how they treat you when they think you're nobody." Sophia nodded slowly, absorbing the lesson. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for giving me a chance to do better." Camille inclined her head. "Thank you for doing the right thing when it mattered." As Sophia moved away to continue her duties, Camille leaned back in her seat and gazed out the window at the endless stretch of sky beyond. This flight had started with cruelty, humiliation, and exposed prejudice. But now, in the sterile hum of 30,000 feet above the earth, it was transforming into something else. A declaration that Summit Skies Airlines would not tolerate a culture where dignity depended on dress or skin color. As the flight neared its final descent into New York, Camille reviewed the notes she had compiled. There would be repercussions, yes. There would be changes, deep and sweeping. But there would also be opportunities for growth, for the company, for the employees who had stumbled, and for those who had risen. The wheels touched down with a smooth jolt, and the plane taxied to the gate. Passengers gathered their belongings, casting Camille occasional glances tinged with respect or apology. As she stood to disembark, a few murmured quiet thanks. Others said nothing but nodded gravely. The message had been delivered, without shouting, without spectacle, but with a force more powerful than anger. Respect must never be optional. Camille made her way up the jet bridge and into the terminal, her mind already racing ahead to the steps that would follow. There would be meetings, trainings, firings. There would be uncomfortable conversations and sweeping reforms. But most of all, there would be a reckoning, and then, if she had anything to say about it, a rebirth. Flight 3342 would not be remembered for the delay or the embarrassment. It would be remembered as the moment Summit Skies Airlines decided to finally become the company it claimed to be. And Camille Dawson, in her worn jeans and battered backpack, had lit the spark that would burn away the old ways and make way for something far better. The terminal's cool air greeted Camille Dawson as she exited the jet bridge, her mind already racing ahead, mapping the changes that would ripple outward from Flight 3342. She walked with quiet purpose through the crowded terminal, ignoring the occasional stares of passengers who recognized her now, not from the newspapers or business magazines, but from what they had just witnessed with their own eyes. By the time Camille reached the executive car waiting at curbside, her plan was crystallized. This wasn't just about disciplining two employees who had shown their true colors. This was about confronting a sickness that had been allowed to fester inside the company culture for far too long. Summit Skies Airlines needed more than an apology tour. It needed a reckoning, and then a rebirth. In the days following the incident, Camille moved swiftly. Captain Edward Blake and Senior Flight Attendant Colin Reeves were summoned for disciplinary hearings, their dismissals finalized in front of an internal ethics panel that left no doubt about the cause: systemic, demonstrated bias incompatible with the company's mission and values. Yet even as the paperwork for their termination crossed her desk, Camille wrestled with a deeper question. Punishment alone wouldn't fix the problem. You couldn't build a stronger house by simply tearing down the old one, you had to lay a better foundation. Camille didn't just want to fire those who failed, she wanted to transform them if they were willing to do the work. So she offered Blake and Reeves a conditional path forward, complete an intensive rehabilitation program, including racial bias training, hundreds of hours of community service in underprivileged communities, regular psychological evaluations, and mandatory frontline service jobs within unrelated industries where they would be forced to experience what it felt like to be unseen, unheard, dismissed. Only then, after measurable proof of growth, would she consider allowing them back into the Summit Skies workforce under strict probation. Surprisingly, they both accepted. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of understanding. While Blake and Reeves embarked on their journeys of uncomfortable self-reflection, Camille turned her attention inward to the systemic rot exposed by Flight 3342. She gathered her senior leadership team in the executive boardroom overlooking downtown Dallas, the city's skyline glittering behind her as she stood at the head of the table. Camille didn't sugarcoat her message. What happened on that flight wasn't just the failure of two employees, she said, her voice low but commanding. It was the failure of every training program, every management decision, every unchallenged assumption that allowed them to believe it was acceptable. Around the polished oak table, executives shifted in their seats, some nodding grimly, others avoiding her gaze. Starting today, Camille continued, we're building something new. We're calling it the Elevate Initiative. And it's not optional. The Elevate Initiative wasn't just another corporate rebranding exercise. It was a complete overhaul of hiring practices, mandatory cultural sensitivity workshops, anonymous peer evaluations, and a newly formed passenger advocacy council that would have real oversight power, not just ceremonial clout. Flight attendants, gate agents, and pilots would all be retrained not just in customer service basics, but in implicit bias recognition, conflict de-escalation, and the fundamental principle that every person who walked onto one of their planes deserved dignity, without exception. News of the Elevate Initiative spread quickly. Industry insiders were skeptical at first. Airlines weren't known for soul-searching, after all. But Camille wasn't interested in lip service. She was interested in measurable outcomes. 6 months later, something extraordinary happened. Camille sat in a small conference room adjacent to her office, facing Edward Blake and Colin Reeves once more. They looked different now, not in the superficial way, but in the deeper, more telling ways that revealed themselves in posture, tone, and the way they listened instead of waiting to speak. Blake's once proud shoulders were humbler now, his voice quieter, more careful. Reeves, too, carried a different weight, one born not of arrogance but of reflection. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us, Blake said, his voice stripped of the entitlement that had once laced every word. We know we don't deserve it. Camille listened, arms folded lightly, her expression giving nothing away. They spoke, one after another, not in excuses but in admissions. Working minimum wage jobs in fast food restaurants, volunteering in shelters, attending counseling sessions designed to rip open the blinders of privilege, they recounted it all. Not defensively, but with the raw vulnerability of men who had seen themselves clearly for the first time. I used to think standards meant protecting first class from anyone who didn't fit a certain mold, Reeves confessed, his voice cracking. But what I really protected was my own comfort, my own biases. I can't undo what I did, but I can change what I do from here on out. Camille let the silence stretch, watching them sit with their discomfort. Then she spoke. I'm offering you a path back, she said, her voice calm but firm. But it's not a return to what you knew. It's a second chance under strict conditions. She outlined the terms: 12 months of probation, quarterly evaluations, zero tolerance for further incidents, and new roles designed not to shield them from discomfort but to force them to confront it daily. Blake would join the pilot diversity training team, using his experience as a cautionary example to teach others. Reeves would return to in-flight service, but under the direct supervision of Sofia Alvarez, the very junior flight attendant he had once treated as invisible. The symmetry wasn't lost on any of them. Both men accepted without hesitation. In the months that followed, the Elevate initiative took root and flourished in ways even Camille hadn't fully dared to dream. Passenger satisfaction scores soared, employee engagement surveys reflected record-high levels of trust in leadership, and instances of bias-related complaints dropped sharply. More importantly, the culture began to change. In subtle, profound ways. It changed in the way flight attendants smiled genuinely at passengers who looked like they didn't belong anywhere special. It changed in the way gate agents offered greetings with warmth rather than suspicion. It changed in the way pilots took pride not just in technical excellence but in the humanity of their profession. 2 years after Flight 3342, Camille stood on a stage at the International Aviation Summit, a sleek banner behind her reading Elevate Initiative, Changing Flight, Changing Futures. She spoke not about the scandal that could have been, but about the movement that was. Real change doesn't come from firing people and forgetting them, Camille said, her voice steady, carrying across the packed auditorium. Real change comes from holding up a mirror, forcing hard conversations, offering redemption, and demanding better every single day. The audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation that echoed for minutes after she finished. Back home at Summit Sky's headquarters, a framed photo hung quietly on the executive floor. Camille Dawson, boarding Flight 3342 in worn jeans and a simple backpack, walking past a line of oblivious staff who would soon learn a lesson far bigger than any audit could teach. Underneath the photo, a plaque read simply, "Every passenger matters. Every flight is a test. Every day is a chance to get it right." And every day, from that moment forward, they tried. At the heart of Camille Dawson's story lies a lesson far greater than any individual flight, airline, or corporate title. It is a lesson about humanity. About the simple, yet profound truth that respect must never be conditional, and dignity should never be something a person has to earn based on how they look, how they're dressed, or what assumptions others make about them. Through Camille's journey, we are reminded that true leadership doesn't just reveal itself in boardrooms or in titles, it reveals itself in how we treat others when we believe no one important is watching. Camille didn't simply correct the injustice done to her, she chose to transform it into a catalyst for change, not through anger or retaliation, but through vision, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to creating something better. For all of us, there's an important reflection here. How often do we make quick judgments based on surface appearances? How often do we allow our assumptions to guide our actions, forgetting that every single person we meet carries a story, a worth, and a dignity no less than our own? The real measure of our character is not how we behave toward those we admire or fear, it's how we treat those we think have nothing to offer us. Let this story be a call to all of us, no matter where we are in life, look deeper. Choose kindness over judgment. Choose dignity over arrogance. Whether you are in a position of leadership or simply passing someone by in your daily routine, your respect can either uplift or wound someone in ways you may never fully see. Choose to uplift. And remember, growth is possible for individuals, for organizations, for society itself. True justice doesn't always mean destruction. Sometimes it means offering a hard path toward redemption and watching transformation unfold. That's where real change takes root, not in shame, but in courage and accountability. On behalf of all of us here at Us Justice Stories, thank you for taking the time to listen, reflect, and share in this powerful journey. Your willingness to engage with these stories of injustice, and more importantly, of transformation, means that hope is still alive for a better, more compassionate world. If this story touched you, if it made you think twice about how we see and treat one another, we invite you to continue this journey with us. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us where you're tuning in from. Most of all, carry these lessons forward into your own life. You never know whose story you might be a part of tomorrow. Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing that justice, respect, and kindness are always worth fighting for. Until next time, stay courageous, stay compassionate, and stay tuned for more true stories that matter.